Do you remember the first time you were told that Adam and Eve were the people who caused all human suffering? You were told that at the beginning of the world there existed two people. They lived in a garden. They were innocent. They were given one rule, and they broke it. And from that moment forward, everything changed. Everything that came after, suffering, work, death, shame, flows from that single act. You accepted this. We were young. You had no reason to doubt it. But there is a question worth asking quietly, without anger or dismissal. If this story is true as written, if Adam and Eve were actual people in an actual garden with an actual serpent, then something should follow logically. Civilization should be impossible. Morality should be nonsensical. Knowledge itself should carry a curse so profound that no human society could function. And yet we do function. We build. We create moral systems. We acquire knowledge and call it good. But there is something institutional religion has never adequately explained to you. The Adam and Eve narrative as taught in churches across the Western world is not simply a story with spiritual meaning. It is a construction. A deliberate arrangement of symbols and claims that becomes incoherent the moment you read it closely, ask it simple questions, and refuse to accept contradiction as mystery. Consider this single fact. The two creation accounts in Genesis, the first in chapter 1 and the second beginning in chapter 2, contradict each other on a fundamental point. In the first account, God creates humanity simultaneously, male and female, in God's image, before vegetation and animals. In the second account, God creates the male alone, then plants a garden, then creates animals as companions, and only then, as an afterthought, manufactures woman from the male's body. They cannot both be literally true. They are not compatible narratives. Yet churches have taught both for nearly 2,000 years without acknowledging the contradiction exists. This is the beginning of our inquiry. In the 17th century, a philosopher named Baruch Spinoza approached this problem differently. He did not defend the story. He did not attack it. He simply read it the way a careful reader reads any ancient text, historically, logically, without assuming that its truth depends on being literal. Before we proceed, it is necessary to say that this examination is not an attack on faith or on those who hold the Adam and Eve narrative as sacred. Spinoza himself was not hostile to Scripture. He understood Scripture as a document created by human beings in specific times for specific purposes. That understanding does not require us to despise it or mock it. It requires only that we read it as we would read anything else, with attention to context, contradiction, and what the text actually says rather than what we have been told it means. Let us begin with the first absurd lie, and by lie I mean a statement that cannot withstand basic scrutiny. Lie number 1. Adam and Eve are historical individuals whose disobedience caused all human suffering. Here is what the text actually states, beginning in Genesis chapter 2. God creates a solitary male from dust and places him in a garden. God grows trees in this garden and permits the male to eat from all except one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God then creates animals and brings them to the male to name. The text tells us that no suitable helper is found among the animals. So God causes the male to sleep, extracts a rib, and from this rib fashions woman. Now the serpent, described as more cunning than any animal of the field, asks the woman whether God truly forbade them from eating of the trees. The woman clarifies that they may eat from the trees, but not from the tree in the midst of the garden. The serpent tells her that she will not surely die if she eats from it. Rather, God knows that eating from it will open her eyes, and she will be like God, knowing good and evil. The woman sees that the tree is good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom. She eats. She gives some to the man. Their eyes are opened. They become aware of their nakedness. They hide. God discovers this and questions them. The man blames the woman. The woman blames the serpent. God pronounces curses. Pain in childbirth for woman. Toil and sweat for man. Enmity between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring. They are expelled. Now, Here is the first problem that churches are reluctant to address. In this narrative, what exactly is the sin? Read the text closely. The serpent's statement is factually accurate. The man and woman do not die when they eat the fruit. They become aware of good and evil exactly as promised. Their eyes do open. They do become, in the serpent's words, like God in knowing good and evil. The serpent told the truth. The God character prohibited knowledge and punished the humans for seeking it. But there is more. What was the knowledge they gained? Not moral understanding, as churches have taught you. The text explicitly states, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked." Their knowledge was nakedness, physical vulnerability, sexuality, the human body's susceptibility to shame. The narrative associates disobedience with sexual awareness. This is not accidental. Churches inherited and perpetuated this association, weaponizing shame around the body and sexuality for millennia. But the text itself reveals the purpose of this narrative. It is not explaining why suffering exists in the world. It is explaining why humans feel shame about their bodies and sexuality. It is a story about the origin of sexual consciousness, told through mythological language. Here is what makes this a lie in the ecclesiastical sense. When churches proclaimed that Adam and Eve's sin caused all suffering, they were reading a mythological account of sexual awakening as if it were historical explanation for universal suffering. They were asking a text designed to answer one question to answer a completely different question. When the text did not contain the answer they needed, they imposed it. But there is a second layer to this first lie. The narrative presents woman as derivative, created from man's body as a solution to his solitude, then portrayed as more easily deceived by the serpent than the man. This is not incidental. The narrative serves a social function. It legitimates male authority and justifies suspicion of female sexuality and female reasoning. Spinoza understood this. He recognized that scriptures contain historical traces of the communities that shaped them. The Adam and Eve narrative carries within it the gender anxieties and power arrangements of the ancient Levantine cultures that produced it. To read it as eternal divine truth about women is to mistake cultural anxiety for metaphysical fact. The lie, then, is this. The narrative was never meant to be read as literal history of universal human sin. It is a mythological account shaped by specific cultural concerns. When churches insisted on literal historical truth, they were not protecting the text's integrity. They were obscuring its actual meaning and misusing it to justify institutional control. Lie number 2. God's prohibition against knowledge is presented as reasonable and just. Return to the narrative. God tells the man that from the tree of knowledge of good and evil he shall not eat, for in the day he eats from it, he shall surely die. This prohibition is strange. God is forbidding the acquisition of moral knowledge. God is saying, in effect, do not become capable of distinguishing right from wrong. Remain in a state of obedience that precedes moral reasoning. Now, one interpretation, common in theological circles, is that the tree represents not knowledge itself, but disobedience. The sin is not gaining knowledge, but breaking a command. Yet the text explicitly states that the tree grants knowledge of good and evil. The text does not present it as a test of obedience. The tree itself is the thing forbidden, and the reason is that eating from it grants understanding. In a narrative constructed by an author aware of human psychology, what kind of prohibition makes someone want to violate it? A prohibition against something that confers power, understanding, and awareness. The narrative is structured to make disobedience inevitable and natural. It is not a story about human wickedness. It is a story about the impossibility of maintaining ignorance when knowledge is available. The deeper question churches avoid: if God truly wanted humans to remain innocent and obedient, why place the tree where they could see it? Why allow a talking serpent to argue for disobedience? Why design the situation in such a way that human curiosity must inevitably be awakened? The answer is that this narrative was not written by an author concerned with making divine justice coherent. It was written by authors engaged in explaining human nature as they observed it. Humans seek knowledge. Humans desire autonomy. These are not aberrations. They are fundamental to human nature. The narrative explains the origin of these drives mythologically. It does not condemn them as successfully as traditional interpretation claims. Lie number 3. Eve sinned first and is therefore primarily responsible for human suffering. The text does state that the woman ate first and gave to her husband. Women have been blamed for human suffering on the basis of this narrative for nearly 2,000 years. But examine what the text actually reveals about their different roles. The serpent approaches the woman, not the man. Why? The text offers no explanation. Yet churches have interpreted this as evidence of female weakness and susceptibility to deception. But consider another possibility. The serpent approaches the woman because she, not the man, is the one who might be receptive to challenge the God character's authority. Recall that the man was created first and given the command directly by God. He received it as a direct order from the authority that created him. The woman was created later, and the command may have come to her through the man's report. Her relationship to the prohibition is mediated. She is therefore in a different epistemic position. She might more easily question something she encountered secondhand. Moreover, it is the woman who explains the prohibition to the serpent. She demonstrates understanding of it. She is not confused or ignorant. She hears the serpent's argument and makes a deliberate choice. She sees that the tree is good for food, beautiful, and desirable for wisdom. These are not acts of weakness. These are acts of agency. The man's behavior is notably different. He is given no argument. He is given no reasoning. He simply eats when the woman offers. The text states she gave some to him, and he ate. No deliberation. No thought. No questioning. By the standards of agency and moral reasoning that churches have used to blame women, the man demonstrates less thought than the woman. Yet the blame has fallen on her. This is not a matter of careful reading. This is a matter of institutional power and control. Blame her, and you control female sexuality. Blame her, and you justify restrictions on female authority. Blame her, and you construct a narrative in which women bear responsibility for human misery. Spinoza recognized this pattern. Religious institutions shape scripture to serve their power. The text does not primarily justify this blame. The interpretation does. Lie number 4. The serpent is Satan, and this narrative explains the origin of evil. In the text itself, the serpent is described as an animal. Crafty, yes, but an animal of the field. The text does not call the serpent Satan. The text does not present the serpent as a cosmic principle of evil or as a fallen angel. These identifications came later, through theological reinterpretation that layered new meaning onto the text. This is not necessarily wrong. Texts evolve. Meaning deepens through reinterpretation. But it is dishonest to claim that the text itself contains an explanation of evil and Satan when it does not. The narrative presents a talking animal challenging a divine prohibition. That is what the text says. Furthermore, the serpent statement is, as we noted, factually accurate. The serpent makes a claim about consequences. The consequences happen exactly as stated. From the perspective of the narrative itself, the serpent is a truth-teller, and God is the one who threatens without following through. God says death will result. Death does not result. Ecclesiastical tradition resolved this by claiming that spiritual death resulted, even if physical death did not. But this is reading into the text. The text uses the language of death simply and directly. In the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. They eat. They do not die. Not physically, not spiritually according to the text. They go on to live hundreds of years. The narrative does not explain the origin of evil. It explains the origin of human consciousness, shame, and mortality. It does not introduce a cosmic enemy. It introduces human awareness of vulnerability. Yet churches have used this narrative for nearly 2 millennia to justify warfare against an enemy called Satan and to position humans as soldiers in a cosmic battle between good and evil. The narrative itself contains no such battle. This is theological elaboration and institutional necessity, not textual content. Lie number 5. The narrative intends a clear moral lesson about obedience. If we read the narrative as a moral lesson, we must ask what behavior it actually rewards and what it punishes. The God character issues a prohibition and punishes violators. The serpent encourages curiosity and autonomy and tells the truth. The man and woman grow in awareness and understanding. They gain the capacity to recognize good and evil. Now, if we read this as pure moral instruction, the lesson appears to be: obey authority without question, even when authority prevents you from gaining understanding. Do not listen to voices that promise knowledge and autonomy. Accept vulnerability and ignorance as your condition. Is this truly the moral the authors intended to transmit? Consider the audience. These narratives were likely shaped and transmitted by educated scribal communities in ancient Israel. These communities valued wisdom. They transmitted other texts celebrating the pursuit of knowledge. Would they truly have crafted a foundational narrative teaching that knowledge is evil and obedience is virtue? Or is it possible that the narrative is more complex? That it recognizes the human drive for knowledge as fundamental and natural, even while acknowledging the costs? That it uses mythological language to explore the human condition rather than to provide a simple moral? The Church's insistence on a clear moral of obedience says more about ecclesiastical concerns than about the text's actual design. Churches needed obedience, so they read the narrative as teaching obedience. When the narrative itself does not clearly teach this, they imposed it. Line number 6. Woman's subordination to man is a natural consequence of her role in the narrative. The text contains a curse directed at the woman. I will greatly increase your pain in childbearing. With pain you shall bear children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Churches have read this curse as a prescriptive statement about how the world should be organized. Woman's subordination is natural, ordained, a consequence of sin. Her painful childbearing is her punishment. But examine what the text actually says. It is a curse, a punishment for a transgression. It is not a description of the natural order. It is a description of consequences, and notably, it describes consequences that are factually true of the human condition, at least in the ancient world. Childbearing was dangerous and painful. Women in ancient societies were subordinate to men in social arrangements. The curse describes actual social and biological realities. But does it prescribe them? Does it say these things should be? No. It describes them as punishments. Here is what the churches have done. They have taken a narrative that describes punishment and reframed it as prescription. They have said, woman's subordination is a curse that came upon all women because of Eve's disobedience. Then they have used that claim to justify the continuation and entrenchment of female subordination. This is a profound dishonesty. The text describes social realities as punitive consequences. Churches have used it to justify perpetuating and defending those punitive realities in the present. They have confused explanation of how things are with prescription of how things should be. Spinoza understood that scriptures contained the prejudices and power arrangements of their time and place. But he also understood that recognizing these prejudices does not require abandoning the text. It requires reading it historically and honestly, which means acknowledging that it reflects human societies, not divine blueprints. Lie number 7. Shame about the human body is natural and necessary. The narrative associates human consciousness with nakedness and shame. Upon gaining knowledge, the first thing the man and woman do is realize they are naked. They hide. They cover themselves. When God discovers them, God asks how they knew they were naked. The text is describing the origin of body shame. It is explaining why humans, unlike other animals, experience shame about nakedness and sexuality. The explanation is mythological and tied to the acquisition of knowledge. Now, here is what churches have done. They have taken this narrative about the origin of body shame and used it to justify the perpetuation of body shame. They have treated the narrative as if it were prescribing shame rather than describing its origin. They have built theologies of the body based on the idea that the body is inherently shameful, that sexuality is inherently corrupted, that nakedness must be hidden. But the narrative itself does not make these prescriptive claims. It explains why shame arose. It does not say shame is good or necessary. It says shame is a consequence of consciousness. This distinction is crucial. If we understand shame as a historical consequence of human consciousness, we can examine whether perpetuating it serves human flourishing. We can ask whether Spinoza's own observation about joy and freedom aligns with a culture of shame and secrecy about bodies and sexuality. Spinoza argued that joy and understanding are inseparable. A culture that teaches shame about fundamental aspects of human nature teaches a kind of fragmentation. The body becomes an enemy. The self becomes divided. Understanding becomes partial. Yet churches have built elaborate theologies around the shame described in this narrative, as if describing the origin of shame were the same as justifying its continuation. Line number 8. This narrative definitively explains why suffering exists in the world and how it came about. This is perhaps the most absurd lie of all, because the narrative does not address suffering as a general phenomenon. It addresses specific human experiences, sexual consciousness, shame about the body, the pain of childbearing, and the necessity of labor. Yet churches have claimed that this narrative explains all suffering. Every disease, every death, every tragedy, every injustice flows from Adam and Eve's disobedience. The narrative does not say this. It does not address suffering broadly. It addresses specific aspects of the human condition tied to consciousness and sexuality. Moreover, the narrative provides no account of why an omnipotent, benevolent God would arrange the situation in such a way that disobedience becomes inevitable and then severely punish the inevitable result. The narrative does not answer the problem of evil. It does not address why suffering exists. It merely mythologically explains certain human experiences as consequences of consciousness. To claim that this narrative solves the problem of evil is to impose a theological agenda onto the text far beyond what it contains. The narrative is smaller and more specific than churches have pretended. Yet this claim has endured for 2,000 years. Every theodicy, every attempt to justify suffering in a world created by a good God, has rested on the claim that suffering is punishment for Adam and Eve's sin. The theodicies fail because the narrative does not support the weight placed upon it. What you are seeing across these 8 points is not a narrative with 8 independent problems. You are seeing a single pattern repeated across the entire ecclesiastical interpretation of Adam and Eve. The pattern is this. Churches took a mythological narrative designed to explore human consciousness and the human condition, a narrative that contained internal contradictions and reflected the prejudices of ancient cultures, and they imposed upon it a clarity, coherence, and moral teaching that it does not contain. They did this systematically and over centuries. Why? Not because they were corrupt or intentionally deceptive, but because institutions require coherence. Institutions require clear moral teaching. Institutions require justification for their structures of authority. The narrative as written did not provide all these things. So the narrative was reinterpreted until it did. This is how human meaning-making works. We impose order on complex phenomena. We construct narratives that serve our purposes. This is not unique to the church. It is universal in human communities. But it becomes problematic when institutions claim infallibility. When they claim that their reading of a text is not interpretation but revelation. When they use textual authority to prevent further questioning or reinterpretation. Spinoza's method breaks this cycle. By reading Scripture carefully and historically, we recognize that human communities produce these texts, that they contain human concerns, human prejudices, human errors. This does not make them worthless. It makes them intelligible. It makes them available for real understanding rather than submission. You may be experiencing discomfort as you hear this analysis. That is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that you are thinking. For generations, you have been taught that questioning these narratives is dangerous, that it represents a loss of faith, a descent into skepticism, a hardening of the heart against truth. You have been taught that certainty is a virtue and doubt is a sin. But Spinoza understood something else. He understood that genuine understanding requires the courage to follow questions where they lead, even when the answers discomfort us. He understood that doubt is not the opposite of faith, but the ground of it. That real faith is not believing despite evidence, but understanding despite fear. The realization that ecclesiastical interpretation of Adam and Eve does not withstand scrutiny does not require that you abandon the text. It requires that you read it more carefully, more honestly, more respectfully than you have before. It requires that you see it as a human document attempting to make meaning of the human condition, not as a divine blueprint for all time. This is not a loss. It is a gain. Because now, when you read the narrative, you can ask what it actually meant to its original communities. You can recognize the wisdom in its mythological exploration of consciousness and shame and labor. You can also recognize its limitations, its prejudices, its historical specificity. You can hold it as a profound human document without needing to believe it is infallible. You can learn from it without needing to obey it. This is what Spinoza offers. Not rejection of meaning, but clarification of it. Not atheism, but a deeper honesty about how human communities create meaning and transmit it across generations. As we conclude, return to that childhood memory with which we began. You are sitting somewhere, and someone older is telling you about a garden and a serpent and a fruit. And you believe it because belief seems safer than doubt. But you are different now. You have read carefully. You have noticed contradictions. You have recognized patterns. You have thought. You do not need to reject what you were taught. You need only to hold it differently. Not as infallible truth, but as human meaning making across centuries. Not as a binding prescription, but as a historical document. Not as the final word, but as the beginning of conversation. The Adam and Eve narrative remains powerful. It still speaks to something true about human consciousness, about shame, about the costs and rewards of awareness. But it speaks to these things through mythology, not through literal history. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. This is the gift and the burden that Spinoza offers. The ability to read more clearly, the freedom to think, and the responsibility that comes with having thought. You are not falling away from truth by examining these narratives carefully. You are approaching them more honestly, more seriously, more respectfully than institutions would allow. And that is enough.